All right, this is going to be the first in a series of videos for Unit 5. Unit 5 is about land and water use, and we're going to start off by talking about the water aspect here, and then we'll move into the land as we get further into the unit. The first topic we're going to cover is the availability of water. So first, we'll just talk about the sources of water on Earth. So nearly 70% of Earth's surface is covered by water. Earth is the blue planet, it's the water planet. It is just a very plentiful resource on Earth. However, not all that water is directly usable for humans. Of the Earth's liquid water, there are 5 main repositories where we can find this water. We have oceans, we have ice and glaciers, groundwater, surface water, and atmospheric sources of water, such as water vapor. Now, the first category, oceans, is in the saltwater category, and this makes up 97% of all liquid water on Earth is actually salt water found in oceans and seas and some inland lakes. This water is non-potable. In other words, it is not suitable for drinking. So it's not really a usable source of water for things like human consumption or livestock consumption or even using for irrigation because salt water is not good for crops. So the only 3%, what that means is only 3% of all liquid water on Earth is actually fresh water and is therefore potable or suitable for drinking or agricultural applications. The vast majority of this fresh water, this 3%, is also locked up in ice and glaciers. So polar ice caps and glaciers make up the vast majority of the fresh water on the surface of the Earth. It's actually not liquid, it is frozen water. So it's about 77.28% of all fresh water is locked up in ice and glaciers, and this is unavailable for human consumption and other uses. Next, we have groundwater. It's about 22% of all the fresh water that's available, and this is actually available for consumption. So groundwater is a major source of usable water for consumption or other human uses. Then we have the surface water, which is what we normally think of when we think of fresh water, things like rivers and streams and lakes and ponds. But that's actually only about 0.47% of all fresh water that is also available for human consumption and use. And then we have the atmospheric water, which is a very significant in function, but it is very small in its actual percentage. It's only about 0.03% of all fresh water. And generally, atmospheric water is unavailable for consumption in its form, but it does you do get precipitation that comes from this, so it does turn into liquid water that is usable. So not all of these are liquid water. Obviously, we do have ice and glaciers, which are solid frozen water, and then we have atmospheric, which is water vapor as well. So what this means, if you add it all up, is that only about 1% or less than 1% of all water on Earth is actually available fresh water. It's a very, very small amount. And these graphs over here show the breakdown between the oceans and seas, which are saltwater, freshwater, and then we look at the freshwater and what that consists of. And primarily, we're looking at ice and glaciers, which is really not available in any practical way for human consumption or use. And actually, that ice, the ice and glaciers, are also what is melting due to climate change and global warming. And when that water melts, it flows into the ocean and just joins in with the rest of the salt water. So we are losing some of that fresh water as well due to climate change. Okay. So now take a look at groundwater and how what groundwater is and where it occurs and the way that we can access it and features associated with groundwater. So groundwater exists in what are called aquifers. So aquifers are permeable layers of rock and sediment that contain groundwater. So this is underneath the ground, sometimes very deep down under the ground, sometimes not as deep. And there are 2 main types of aquifer. We have an unconfined aquifer and a confined aquifer. So an unconfined aquifer is an aquifer that is made of porous rock that's covered by soil out of which the water can easily flow. So basically, an unconfined aquifer is open to the surface. So if you're standing on the ground, on the surface, and you were to go down through the soil, you would eventually meet water that is held in this unconfined aquifer, and there's no barrier between that and the surface, really. It's just digging down some number of feet down to where the water level is. And the water can easily flow down into the unconfined aquifer and likewise can easily flow out of the unconfined aquifer. The other type is a confined aquifer, which is an aquifer that is surrounded by a layer of impermeable rock or clay, and this impedes water flow into and out of the aquifer. So if you take a look at this this picture right over here, figure 26.2, you see that we have an unconfined aquifer right here, and we have a confined aquifer right here. And so if we take a look at the unconfined aquifer, you see that it's actually it's directly open to the topsoil above and actually the surface, and even encounters the surface here where this little stream is going. The confined aquifer has this impermeable layer of rock, and underneath, below that impermeable layer of rock, there's a cavity here of some permeable rock that is able to hold, or just open space that is able to hold water, and so that's where that confined aquifer occurs. And so there's not an easy in or out to this particular space where the confined aquifer is, whereas the unconfined aquifer, again, is open to the surface. So when we are looking at aquifers and talking about groundwater, another important concept to understand is the water table. So the water table is, as it says, is the uppermost level at which water in a given area fully saturates the rock or the soil. So in other words, if you were digging down in the dirt, like you're digging a well or something, eventually, in most places, you'll come to a point where there is water that has fully saturated the soil. So basically, if you're removing soil, you'll come to a place where there's just water just down underground. In general, the water table is the uppermost portion of the aquifer. So the water table is the uppermost portion of the aquifer. And so you can see right here, the water table is labeled, and I'll kind of trace it right there. There's the water table right there. That's the water table for the unconfined aquifer. If you were looking at the confined aquifer, then this would be the water table of the confined aquifer. So that's the uppermost layer where you have full saturation of water down in the soil. Okay, so aquifers are basically pools of water, pools of fresh water that are we are able to remove water from the aquifers, or water is able to leave the aquifers. Sometimes it's easy with an unconfined aquifer, or maybe more difficult with a confined aquifer. But also water is able to refill or recharge the aquifer as well. So they can be refilled or recharged if precipitation, primarily it happens through precipitation, and if it is able to percolate through the soil down to the aquifer. And so this is called groundwater recharge, so the process by which water percolates through the soil and works its way into an aquifer. Now, confined aquifers have a very limited way of recharging. They can only be recharged if the impermeable layer of rock has a surface opening that can serve as a recharge area. So in this diagram right here, there is a point where this confined aquifer actually rises up to the surface, and there's this small little area right here, this small little patch of land, and maybe it extends all the way along this little corridor right here, but it's a small little area there. That's the recharge area, and so if precipitation falls there, it can actually percolate down and fill up that confined aquifer, but they're much more limited with their recharge capabilities, and they generally take much longer. For that reason, the confined aquifers are not as sustainable or renewable as a source of fresh water if they are overused. So aquifers are important sources of fresh water for many organisms. Plant roots will access groundwater in aquifer. They'll grow down into the soil, and they can access water that's down in the soil, especially in unconfined aquifers. Water from aquifers naturally percolates up to the surface at times as springs, and these springs can turn into spring-fed streams, which can turn into rivers. This is very, very common in places that get a good amount of rainfall. And this is what I was just saying, streams and rivers can result. Now, this is not necessarily this is a little different idea here than the spring. So sometimes the water can percolate upwards and come out as a spring. We have a natural spring that's shown right here. But also, there are situations with unconfined aquifers where the water table actually can encounter the surface and create overlap the surface, and when that happens, you can actually get streams and rivers that result that really show you right where the water table is, moving into the banks on either side of the stream or the river, and that's where the water table is basically just exposed to the surface, and you have flowing water in a river or a stream. So not only are aquifers available for plants and trees and animals that might live in a stream, or animals that might drink from a stream that results from a spring or a water table intersecting with the surface. But humans also access groundwater as well. And this is extremely common worldwide. We often access groundwater, and we do this. This is what we are doing when we dig a well. So if a person is digging a well, what they're doing is they're trying to go down into the ground and access one of these aquifers that's holding water, whether it's an unconfined aquifer or a confined aquifer. So most wells, they're just simply very deep holes, and they're dug down to the point where they encounter the water table, and they go below the water table. And so here you see a well that has been dug down below the water table, and it's a hole, and there's water that's down there in the well. And in most cases, water has to be pumped to the surface against the force of gravity, because the water is down in the well, in the bottom of the hole that is the well. Now, sometimes, however, wells can be dug into confined aquifers, and that is what is shown right here. Is someone has dug a well, they pass through the unconfined aquifer in this example, gone through this impermeable layer of rock, and access the confined aquifer. And when that happens, oftentimes water that is in confined aquifers is under tremendous pressure because of the overlying impermeable layer of rock. It's pushing down with tremendous pressure, gravity on that water that's down in the aquifer. And if there's, and basically there's very few outlets for that water. So if it's kind of like a release valve is created when you dig a well down into the confined aquifer. And what can happen is the pressure in the confined aquifer can be so great that it actually can force the water to rise, all the way to the surface without needing a pump. And this is called an artesian well when this happens. So it's an artesian well. It's a well created by drilling a hole into a confined aquifer where the pressure is great enough to force the water up against the force of gravity and out of the well up to the surface. And these wells, if you can find one of these, it's a really nice thing to have, because they don't require a pump, so they don't require any extra energy to get the water down from in the ground up to the surface. The water just naturally flows up on its own because of the pressure, the great pressure that's being applied within the confined aquifer. So the age of the water that's in an aquifer can vary greatly, and so can the rate of recharge. So the age of the water varies, and so does the rate of recharge. And you might think that the age of the water is not that big a deal, and maybe you don't want really old water because maybe it's really old and stale. But actually it turns out that the older the water is, the more likely it is to be very clean and well purified. So the age of the water and the rate of recharge affects both water quality and the sustainability of the aquifer as a water source. Now, unfortunately, these two things kind of work against each other. So in general, if we're looking at unconfined aquifers, remember these are aquifers that essentially are permeable right from the surface right down into the aquifer. There's no impermeable layer of rock. And so these types of aquifers, while they're much easier to access, they're much shallower, they're not as deep down in the soil, they have a very fast recharge, which can be just a few days or to a few years for water to percolate down into the aquifer and begin refilling it, like when you have a nice rain event or something like that. So the water is relatively young. Now, what that means, though, because you have a fast recharge, the water is much more likely to be contaminated by anthropogenic activities, much more likely to be contaminated by human man-made activities, much more likely to have pollution in it, or maybe whether that's pesticide pollution or herbicide pollution, or maybe it's just too much fertilizer, so you have too high nutrients, which can cause algae growth and bacterial growth and that sort of thing. So this water, because it has a very fast recharge, it's very young, it hasn't had the opportunity to be thoroughly filtered and cleaned, which is what one of the primary functions of soil is, to clean and filter water. It hasn't had that opportunity to go through that filtration process because it recharges very quickly. So it's much more likely to be contaminated by things that humans have done. Now, confined aquifers, they have a very, very slow recharge. Sometimes on the order of 10,000 to 20,000 years or more for water to percolate down from the surface down into the aquifer. So as a result, this water is much older. Now, what that means, it doesn't mean that it's stale. What it means is that it's incredibly clean and fresh. It has had thousands of years to be filtered as it passed through the soil very slowly through the recharge area down into the aquifer. So this water is much less likely to be contaminated by anthropogenic activities. However, as you can see, because the recharge rate is so slow, 10 to 20,000 years or more, the water that is taken out, that is pumped out, whether you have a well or an artesian well, it takes very long time to replenish that aquifer and to recharge it. And for that reason, it's not really a renewable resource. It's more of a non-renewable resource. So as a result, large-scale use of water from a confined aquifer ultimately is unsustainable because the withdrawal of water is not balanced by recharge. It's almost impossible to use an unconfined aquifer in a way that is sustainable. Now, it is possible to use it almost indefinitely if it's a large enough aquifer and you're very judicious and careful about the water that you take out. And then if you have a large enough aquifer, like for example, in the United States, the largest aquifer in the United States is the Ogallala Aquifer. This is in the Great Plains. It stretches through 8 western states from South Dakota to Texas. You can see it here in this diagram. So here's South Dakota, Wyoming, parts of Wyoming, Nevada, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and into Texas. So this is the Great Plains area here, where you have these huge grasslands that are highly productive soil. We have converted these to very highly productive farmland, some of the richest, most highly productive farmland in the United States. So the surface area of the Ogallala Aquifer is about 450,000 square kilometers or 175,000 square miles. So it's massive in size. You can see it's larger than the entire state of New York, larger than maybe several states together. Now, large amounts of water have been withdrawn from the Ogallala Aquifer over the last 150 years or so. These have been withdrawn for simple household use, household wells, but also agricultural and industrial uses for things like irrigation or if there's water that's needed for some industrial processes. And generally, these agricultural and industrial uses are the real culprits that are withdrawing just millions and millions of gallons. And so the Ogallala Aquifer is now starting to show some major signs of depletion. And it's unfortunate because it's a major source of fresh water for many millions of people that live in this area. So like mostly confined aquifers, the slow recharge rates of the Ogallala Aquifer have not been able to keep up with withdrawal rates. So on average from 1950 to 2015, the average water depth of the Ogallala Aquifer, the water table has declined by about 5 meters, about 16 feet. Now that doesn't sound like a whole lot, and it's actually not if it was spread out evenly throughout the entire aquifer. But this is the average decline. What is really happening is that there are localized declines, and there are some places where you actually have the water table that has stayed relatively stable, or maybe even gone up a little bit. And that's what you see with like these green areas here up in Nebraska, or the gray areas where there's you have some rising of the water table. But if you look at these areas that are sort of orange and yellow and red and pink, these are areas where you have had massive drops in the water table. So the water table, and you can see here, it's in some places more than 150 feet down. The water table has dropped, and that is extremely significant. If you have a well, a lot of people's wells have dried up because the water table has dropped down below 150 feet below where their well was adequate before. If this rate continues, the overall trend for the Ogallala Aquifer is that it's going to dry up, or the water is going to become inaccessible practically. And so the Great Plains could run out of water potentially this century. These areas, at least these areas that depend on the Ogallala for their household water usage and their agriculture and industrial uses. So now we're going to take a look at what happens when aquifer withdrawal rates exceed the recharge rates. There are predictable changes that occur that we can start to recognize when this is happening in a particular location. So some of the changes that may begin to occur when the withdrawal rates exceed those recharge rates, the water table will begin to drop. As the water table begins to drop, springs and spring-fed streams may begin to dry up. So you have springs and your spring-fed streams will dry up. If you have shallow wells that were accessing the water table with no problem, they may no longer be able to reach the water table, and so they have dried up as well. So here we see this situation here where we have this example water table here. This is before heavy. This is before heavy pumping right here, and so we've got a well. That's probably for residential, for just household use here, household water usage. The well goes down, taps into the water table right here, and it's relatively shallow though. It doesn't go way down deep into the water table. Here's another relatively shallow well right here. And then here you have a really deep well that goes way down into the water table. And so what can happen if there's heavy pumping that is pumping out, maybe this well right here is being used for irrigation, and there's the withdrawal rate is exceeding the recharge rate, you can see a cone of depression form. So cone of depression is really, it's a localized lowering of the water table, and it happens around a well. So it's localized, so it's a sort of a small scale lowering of the water table, happens around a well from which the water is being rapidly withdrawn. So essentially, it's like an upside down cone. So you see here's this cone of depression. So where you can see there's little cones of depression around these little shallow wells here, but they're not all that significant. Then this large deep well right here has significantly lowered the water table. You see this cone of depression that forms a sort of upside down cone shape, like an upside down volcano almost is what it kind of looks like. And so what that does is it causes the water table to be lowered all around it. And so these adjacent wells that are much shallower are not reaching the water table anymore. So essentially they've dried up. And so this person right here, maybe this is their farm and they have 2 wells. And so this well has caused their other personal household well to dry up. Whereas, and I think maybe this field is drawn to show that there's irrigation going on, little sprinklers through the field. And then across the street, across the road, their neighbor right here, who just has their own little household well, well, now their well is dried up because of what their neighbor across the road did with this large well right here. So this can obviously create conflict, and conflicts have arisen over access to water and some people using this shared resource. This is a tragedy of commons kind of situation. The Ogallala Aquifer is a very is sort of a classic, large-scale, dramatic example of tragedy of the commons. Okay, so now we'll take a look at what can happen when you have wells near coastlines. So sometimes if you are lowering the water line or water table because of you're rapidly withdrawing water and you are living near the ocean, this can cause some problems with the salt water that is a natural part of the ocean ecosystem. So the water quality of wells that are near coastlines can be adversely affected when the aquifer withdrawal rates exceed the recharge rates in these wells that are near the coastline. So what happens if we're looking at the groundwater point of view, so we're looking at this groundwater interaction here between the fresh water that's coming from the terrestrial land environment and the salt water that's coming from the ocean environment, you can have groundwater that is salt water, and that does happen beneath the ocean. And some of that salt water, generally, when you're at the coastline, that salt water is intruding into the ground underneath the continental plates, underneath the terrestrial land plates, because that probably there's a lot of pressure coming in from that salt water because it has the entire weight of the ocean behind it. And also this land often tends to be, the terrestrial environment tends to be more permeable than land beneath the ocean, or the crust beneath the ocean. But in any event, salt water is more dense than fresh water. So when this happens, generally what will happen is if you have an aquifer that has a mix of fresh and salt water, what will happen is the fresh water is essentially floating on top of the salt water because it is less dense. And so it's exerting this pressure down on the salt water because of its own mass. Its own weight is pushing down on the salt water, but they don't mix because they really don't mix very much at all because it is much less dense than fresh water is much less dense than salt water. Now, that downward pressure prevents the adjacent ocean water from flowing into the aquifer too much and mixing with the groundwater. Now, what can happen though is if we build a well, so somebody wants to build their big mansion on the cliff here to overlook the ocean, and they like to live in the country a little bit, so they have to build a well to access their water for their house. Well, they build this well down into this water table. But in general, the aquifer, the freshwater portion of the aquifer near the coastline is going to be a little bit smaller than if you are inland, further inland. And so if they're rapidly pumping wells along the coastline, it can create that standard sort of cone of depression. It can lower the water table to the point where there's a reduced amount of pressure of the fresh water pushing down on the salt water, and you get what is called saltwater intrusion, where that salt water can intrude into the fresh water that's in the aquifer and start mixing with it. So this is an infiltration of salt water in an area where the groundwater pressure has been reduced because of the extensive drilling, or maybe just simply the extensive pumping of water, fresh water out of an aquifer. And obviously saltwater intrusion, if it intrudes to the point where it is getting into your well, well, now your well is pumping out salt water, and salt water is no good for water coming out of your kitchen sink when you're trying to cook or trying to drink that water, or even taking a shower. It's salt water is just not a workable situation. So you'll have to drill a new well or figure out some other way to get fresh water into your home. All right, so we spent some time talking about groundwater. Now we're going to shift to the other type of water that is available for human consumption and use, and generally other terrestrial organisms, plants, and animals. And this is surface water. So the surface water is water that exists, as it says, on the surface, above ground. Any body of water found on Earth's surface. Now, it does include oceans. Oceans are technically, whoops, I have a delay with what I'm writing here, so don't worry about it. It does include oceans, but primarily we're not talking about oceans as surface water that's available for most human uses. So here we're talking about surface fresh water, and so this includes all the surface water you see that's fresh that you can encounter as you go through life. Things like streams, rivers, ponds, lakes, and wetlands are your primary examples of surface fresh water. That is water that's laying on the surface of the earth. So these waters do typically represent they represent freshwater biomes. So a stream is a particular kind of aquatic environment in a river. The streams and rivers are related. Ponds and lakes are related, but they represent a particular kind of freshwater environment. And then wetlands also likewise represent a particular kind of freshwater biome. And as such, they perform many important functions, perform ecosystem services. They provide all kinds of different habitats for many, many different organisms. So now, since the beginning of humans, early human civilizations have typically settled along major rivers. Humans are drawn to fresh surface water because obviously, apart from oxygen, there is no other thing that is so vitally important to human life and basically all life as water and fresh water. So access to fresh water has always been a draw for human civilizations, and a lot of these civilizations tend to settle along rivers, actually, as opposed to things like ponds and lakes. Although those are places where people have settled historically as well. But the function of a river, it does have a couple of additional functions that a lake may not have. First of all, it is a source of potable water. Remember, potable means drinkable water. But because the rivers and streams are moving water, they also provide a relatively easy modes of transportation, especially if you're going downstream. They also, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the next couple of slides, rivers are frequently, and much more so than streams and lakes, or not streams, I'm sorry, than ponds and lakes, rivers are surrounded by fertile land. And we'll get into why that is in the next couple of slides, because there's flooding that happens that increases the fertility of land around rivers. So not only is there fresh water that is available, easy access to fresh water, there is transportation opportunities. In addition, because of the moving water, historically humans have used rivers to remove their waste, whether it is their sewage or early on, it was sewage and garbage just dumped into a river, and it just flows downstream, and it's gone, out of sight, out of mind. And then later, when we started industrializing, then we would get things like chemicals and other pollutants be added into the rivers and streams. Now, this is not great at all. Has led to many problems, but it is locally effective. So locally, it's pretty great. If you can imagine that the sewage going downstream just disappears, that has worked well for humans historically for thousands of years. Now, one of the reasons I mentioned on the previous slide for humans settling around rivers and streams is that they are surrounded by fertile land. And this is because rivers and streams naturally overflow their banks during periods of spring snowmelt or heavy rainfall. And the excess water spreads out into an area that is called the floodplain. So the floodplain is an area of land that's adjacent to a river or a stream. Generally, we're talking about rivers when we talk about major floodplains here, though. And it is subject to flooding according to historical trends. So what happens when a river overflows its banks, this happens periodically with all rivers, and it could happen seasonally because of snowmelt, or when you, again, like I said, you have heavy rainfall. This is something that people can depend on, and people have modified their lives around. Floods can be very damaging, but also if the floods are predictable in nature, people have mitigated this with their settlements to deal with it, because what happens, the natural flooding that occurs is an extremely effective fertilizer for the surrounding soil in the floodplain. So the floodwater is carrying all kinds of nutrient-rich sediments that it has brought from its catchment, its watershed upstream, and it's bringing all this nutrient-rich sediment that overflows, and then as the water speed slows down, it drops out and is deposited on the soil within the floodplain, and it's like adding fertilizer to the floodplain, and this happens on a regular basis in all natural rivers. So for millennia, humans have used rivers and their highly productive floodplains as centers of civilization. There's countless examples. I just I did a little 5-minute little Google search and pulled out a whole bunch of famous settlements historically. A few really old ones, and a few that are still, and most of these are still around today, all around rivers. So ancient Egypt and currently Cairo in Egypt, all the civilization centers all around the Nile River. Babylon was between the Tigris and Euphrates River. London is on the Thames. Paris is on the Seine. New Orleans and St. Louis are both on the Mississippi River. I looked at New York City is on the Hudson River. Shanghai is on the Yangtze River. Moscow has the Volga River, Budapest has the Danube River, and there's many, many more. This is just all over the earth, wherever humans are, they have settled on rivers because of all the positives that rivers bring with the fresh water and the transportation and the floodplain, the nutrient-rich floodplain. Now, when it comes to some of the other freshwater biomes, surface water, we have ponds and lakes. These are typically formed in depressions in the landscape. They are filled with, they can be filled with precipitation or with runoff, or sometimes with groundwater. So all of these can fill up and create ponds and lakes. Now, lakes can be created by a variety of processes. Sometimes these depressions that fill up water are formed by tectonic activity, sometimes by glaciation. These are probably the two primary ways that are natural that lakes and ponds form. So things like the Caspian Sea, Lake Baikal, Lake Victoria, and Lake Tanganyika in Africa. All of these are formed by tectonic processes. Well, it's uplift in the case of the Caspian Sea, or tectonic fissures with Baikal, Victoria, and Tanganyika. And in North America, some of the largest lakes in the world, the largest lakes in North America are the Great Lakes, and those were formed through glaciation. Okay, so remember, also, so move on, lakes have also been a source of a place where humans have settled, and for a wide variety of reasons, a lot of those very similar to the reasons for settling around rivers as well. Here in this figure also we have some stats on some of the world's largest lakes. So we can look at lakes based on their volume, or we can look at them based on their maximum depth, or we can look at them based on their surface area. And so these are some of the largest lakes in the world based on some of these different metrics, different ways of looking at lakes. So if you remember freshwater wetlands, they provide water distribution and regulation ecosystem services. So way back a few units ago, unit 1 or 2, we talked about biomes, and when we talked about wetlands, they they are really, really good at distributing and regulating water, fresh water. And they do this because they're like sponges. They can absorb huge amounts of water that could otherwise lead to catastrophic flooding. So the largest wetland in the world is the Pantanal in South America, and the second largest is actually in the United States. It's the Florida Everglades in Florida. So next we'll talk briefly here about atmospheric water, so water vapor that's up in the atmosphere. So although the atmosphere contains only a very small percentage of water of all the fresh water on Earth, it's only 0.03% if you recall, it is essential for the global water distribution system and the water cycle. And that's because this is where precipitation comes from, our rain and our snow. So people that live in arid regions are often almost entirely dependent on precipitation for their water needs, because there's so little water that falls to the ground and actually can percolate down and produce lakes and streams or groundwater aquifers that are available. So there's a lot of rainwater collection in these arid regions where and they're not getting much rain either. Now, sometimes what can happen is, and this is happening more and more with our changing global climate, predictable rainfall patterns can sometimes experience unexpected droughts, for example. So a couple of examples, 2004 and 2017, both severe drought years in Africa, affecting millions of people. In 2017, a strong El Nino resulted in the worst drought in a century, more than a century, in South Africa. And there's some pictures here. You can see here's South Africa, and these areas in the red were areas that were experiencing extreme drought. And so there's a picture. Here's a cow that's normally out here grazing, and there's nothing to graze, and the water's all dried up, and you can see these the mud is just cracked because of the water is gone. So droughts, if they occur with relative frequency, they can have long-term effects on soil. And soil, as we learned in the last unit, is really fundamental to terrestrial life. Droughts can cause the soil, obviously, to dry out. And then once that soil is dried out, one of the things that water does is it has this this internal cohesiveness that holds itself to itself. When you lose that water, basically, if you have any kind of wind coming along, strong winds can blow away the soil. The soil can just be blown away. So you can have wind erosion. It adversely affects nutrient cycling. A lot of nutrients that are recycled in the environment depend on being dissolved in water for at least some portion of the cycle, and that can affect reducing the fertility of the soil. The soil can harden because it can dry up, become impermeable. Like the previous slide, we had the cow. And this also can reduce infiltration, increasing runoff, which can further lead to soil erosion even when it does rain, because the ground is so hard, it has become impermeable, and so that water that could potentially replenish the soil can oftentimes just erode it instead. In the U.S. in the early 1930s, there was massive conversion in the Central Plains of grasslands, natural grasslands, to wheat crops, which were not very good at holding the soil together. This was combined with prolonged droughts, and it resulted in massive dust storms, and this is famously called the Dust Bowl. There were some massive dust storms that brought dust all the way to the east coast of the United States, all the way to Washington, D.C., from places like Texas and Oklahoma. So this is a picture from 1935 of a huge dust storm happening in Texas. Okay, so finally we just have one last slide here about having to deal with flooding. And how this can relate to some of the human activities. So wherever you have a water input that exceeds the ability of an area, that is generally the soil area, to absorb the water, you can get flooding. So human activities can worsen or increase the risk of flooding because what happens often when humans come into an area and they settle an area, they will replace the porous soil and the wetlands that are often present and really good at absorbing large amounts of precipitation. They can be replaced with large impermeable surfaces. So an impermeable surface is defined right here. This is a surface. It's pavement or buildings, or it could be any surface that does not allow water penetration. So water cannot percolate down. So basically the water, if it lands on there, that impervious surface, is just going to flow over that surface. And that can really cause some serious flooding and erosion and damage. So stormwater will run off those impermeable surfaces. It collects in larger and larger, sort of temporary rivers and streams. It collects in storm sewers or streams. And this can cause these rivers and streams to overflow their banks. But it's an unnatural kind of flooding, not that sort of natural seasonal kind of flooding. and that can be very severe, cause lots of erosion, can be very quick and violent, and it can lead to lots of crop and property damage and losses of animal and human lives. So a lot of cities and developments that are trying to be environmentally sensitive will be looking at their impermeable surfaces and try to limit them, or try to use different types of surfaces that are a little more permeable when you have new construction going on to mitigate and avoid this flooding problem, these erosion problems that can arise. All right, that's it for this first video for Unit 5.